We're right at 9 a.m., so I want to welcome everyone this morning to our discussion of the science and some stories about how animals help humans with their well-being. My name is Monica Medina. I want to welcome everyone here. I am very excited about this panel because it's so positive and it really fits so well in the summit about optimism, and we all need a little of that right now. I write a daily environmental e-newsletter called Our Daily Planet, and every day we try to include a story about animals and about optimism. So we certainly support this approach and are thrilled to be part of this incredible panel with these wonderful panelists. And when it comes to conservation, animals never fail to draw the public in. That's what we've learned in our daily writing, our newsletter. Not everyone can make the connections between habitat conservation and the extinction of species and climate change. Those are tough scientific topics, but everyone understands at some intuitive level why we want to conserve tigers and gray wolves, particularly if they have a dog or a cat of their own. Mahatma Gandhi said, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated," and we certainly all believe that on this panel. And we cannot forget that the situation we're in now is because across the planet, we've not been mindful of the way we treat nature and animals. Loss of habitat and the sale of wildlife in unregulated markets around the world makes us all more vulnerable, no matter where it happens. We need to change. And love of animals and wildlife can help persuade people to make the changes that we need. Our nation may be divided over many things, but conserving animals and the environment is something that most Americans agree on. And we don't have to accept. In fact, most Americans reject the false choice between prosperity and sustaining the natural world around us. And now, more than ever, we see our well-being as more than just GDP and ever-increasing wealth. We have an excellent panel to dive into this topic today with us, and we are thrilled for the chance to discuss it with you. And so let me introduce them right now because they're incredible, each of them in their own right. First, Stephanie Marken, the Executive Director of Education and Research at Gallup Pollsters. And Stephanie has two cats of her own, Fiona and Kate. They're indoor ladies, so they've been enjoying this time with her, I'm sure. We also have Beth Allgood, the U.S. Director of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and Beth also has two cats, Katerina and Squeak, a mom and her daughter. And finally, LaFontaine, the President and CEO of Humane Rescue Alliance, and she has two dogs, and I hope I get the name right, Zarek and Tedward, and a cat named Harold. So let's dive into this deep dive. Stephanie's going to start by helping us understand the broader context of this discussion, telling us about some very interesting polling that shows how much agreement there is in the US and around the world today on conservation and sustainability. Stephanie, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here and thank you for having me. I'm going to start off this morning by talking a little bit about this concept of subjective well-being, exactly how we go about measuring it, the factors that are really important to influencing how we think about our own well-being. And finally, my hope is that by the end of the discussion, you'll have a really great sense of how our animals and exposure to wildlife influence and relate to those key factors as we think about our own well-being. So I'll explain a little bit about how we go about measuring well-being around the world. So at Gallup, we use the Gallup World Poll to do this. And the Gallup World Poll is a nationally representative study that we conduct in 140 plus countries each year, dating back to 2006. The study is unique because we actually select a random sample of individuals within each of the countries in which we're interviewing. And we use a similar questionnaire around the world. So that allows us to compare attitudes, behaviors, opinions, feelings, and thoughts among the world's population in each of these countries. We include a series of questions on that survey about law and order, food and shelter, quality of life. One of the most important questions is around this issue of well-being, and we use the Cantrell scale to do so. So we ask, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life. The bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life. Then we ask people on which step of the ladder they feel they stand personally at this time on that 0 to 10 scale. And then we use that to categorize their well-being. Now, there are a series of environments that we know are influential to how people think about their well-being. One of the most important findings that's featured in the World Happiness Report, which is the basis of the data and the findings that I'll share here this morning, is that a supportive social environment not only raises life evaluation, it actually provides the greatest lift for those that are most in misery or experience the greatest hardship. So it's incredibly important in creating resilience in individuals and at the country, city, and even global level. Now, there are a series of environments in which we know are really important for people and their well-being. There are 4 key factors that we find are most influential when we look at country well-being scores. And these account for about half of the average differences between the countries in which we measure. The first of which is having someone to count on. This is the most important of the 4 factors. The second is experiencing generosity. We also find freedom to make life choices, and feeling like that autonomy to control one's life is incredibly important. And then the 4th and final factor is just believing that there's an absence of corruption where we live. And one of the other most important findings that's included in this research is that interpersonal trust and even trust in institutions is hugely important to how we think about our well-being. We find in countries where there are high levels of interpersonal trust and trust in institutions, well-being is much higher at the country level. Now, we also track negative affect around the world, in addition to subjective well-being. We track it in several different ways. The research that's shared in the World Happiness Report support this theory that's commonly held in psychology, that the existence of positive emotions is actually more important than the absence of negative ones when predicting things like longevity or resistance to the common cold. And so again, as we think about resiliency, positive emotions are incredibly important in creating that resiliency at the national and individual level. Now, we track 3 types of negative affect around the world. And unfortunately, what we find is that these 3 experiences and feelings are actually on the rise globally. So we tracked worry. This is the percent of people who report that they worried yesterday. And we find that that's consistently increased since 2006 when we first started measuring. We also track sadness, and we find again that has consistently increased in time in the percent of people reporting that they've experienced sadness. And then finally, we find issues of experiencing anger are also increasing globally. Now, of these 3 types of negative affect, we do find worry and sadness are the most significant increases as compared with anger. Now, we talked a little bit about this in Monica's opening remarks, but we know the environment is incredibly important to individuals and how we think about our own well-being. And we find globally that the importance of the environment is nearly universal across countries around the world. 62% of people globally say that they would prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. We find 74% perceive global warming as a very or somewhat serious threat to them and their families. And 65% believe climate change will make their lives personally harder. Now, we also look at individual environmental effects on well-being, and globally what we see is the presence of pollutants as measured by OECD data, which is overlaid on top of Gallup World Poll data, does have a significant and negative impact on well-being. We also see average temperature and the maximum temperatures in any individual country have a negative impact. What's interesting is minimum temperatures do not have that same impact. So maximum temperatures are what people report as negatively impacting their well-being. And we also didn't see any differences in average monthly precipitation and well-being scores and ratings by country. Now, the World Happiness Report goes into more detail in a specific case study in the case of London. And what you'll see there is they document a series of positive effects that are really significant when we look at subjective well-being. So they saw, for example, that being outdoor in green or blue spaces had a significant and positive impact on well-being, as did unbroken sunshine, air temperatures of 25 degrees Celsius or more, walking or hiking outdoors. Several of these activities that we know have a very significant impact of our well-being are obviously also related to our exposure to wildlife, right? So nature watching, sporting activities, and just being outside. Now, I've included here the top 20 countries so you can get a sense of how countries fall out in this ranking, of which we have 153. And what you'll see is Nordic countries tend to do really well in these country by country rankings. And this has been consistent over time. Nordic countries in general have higher levels of that interpersonal institutional trust that I described. And that is why you'll always see them towards the top of our well-being ranking list. The United States comes in at 18, and that's been pretty consistent over time, although it's changed by about 2 rankings since the last report. In terms of the bottom countries, we find that Afghanistan rounds out the bottom of the list, as does South Sudan, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and the Central African Republic. We do see some important trends globally. So one of the most important and interesting ones is that smaller countries have had faster growth as we measure well-being over time in terms of the percent that are happy than those in the largest countries. We also find average life evaluation at the top 10 countries is almost twice as high as the bottom 10 countries, meaning there's tremendous differences between countries at the top and the bottom of that list in terms of their life evaluation. We've seen a consistent decline in attitudes and experiences in MENA specifically, and also declines in South Asia, although those are largely driven down by India declines. And income differences do help explain some of the differences between countries. Now, we always get that good question about what does subjective well-being add to our discussion around the quality of life in any given country, and why can't we just look at things like GDP? And a great case study and example of this dates back actually to 2005. If you were to measure GDP over time starting in 2005, what you would have seen is in the case of Egypt, GDP was increasing tremendously and consistently over time. Now, we all know that the Arab uprisings began in 2011 and were rather significant. What we know now is that well-being was actually a great leading indicator in that, right? So well-being and subjective well-being specifically as measured by our life evaluation measure was actually consistently decreasing over time and significantly so leading up to the Arab Spring. And that's why GDP can never tell the whole story about the quality of life in any given country or area, city, local. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm happy to take questions via email or Twitter as that's helpful, and I'll turn it back over to Monica.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was fascinating. It's really amazing to see how the poll results bear out some of what we know from our own stories and our own lives. Now we'll turn to Beth Allgood, who will tell us about her work at the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Beth sees the very real connections between policies about species conservation and how communities are coming together now around animal well-being and the quality of life in our society today, particularly during the COVID pandemic and our time staying at home. And I think we'll also be doing some audience participation during this part of the talk. So without any further ado, here is Beth.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you, Lisa, for particularly talking about that gap between GDP and well-being, because it's one of the first things that it really rocked my world when I realized that in Bhutan, there was an alternative to measuring GDP as a proxy for well-being. And it was what really connected me to this work in the first place. I have my master's in business, and I went all through that and working before I realized that that GDP didn't indicate how successful we were as a society. It took sort of responding to disasters, which IFAW does, to recognize, disasters, natural disasters increase GDP, and they certainly don't increase our well-being in any sense. So that was one thing that turned it on for me. And another thing was I was working on ivory and trying to stop ivory, get an ivory ban in the US, basically working on a campaign. And I was thinking, what is it that drives us to have a piece of an animal, to trade in animal parts and products, or to develop, this beautiful habitat instead of valuing the animal itself, the life of the elephant, or the beautiful habitat, and it really comes down, I think, to the values as a society or as a collective that we have in valuing the economic growth, the short-term economic growth versus these broader well-being values that we as individuals seem to value so well, but aren't reflected in our policy. So that got me started in these well-being measures, trying to understand them more and trying to see how we could fit animals into them. So that's sort of the spark of this work that I was doing. So we're seeing, I'm going to try to share some slides. I'm not as adept as Stephanie, I don't think, but I'm going to try it. Let's see. Is that working? Okay. I'm assuming that's working unless someone tells me it's not. So we have these beautiful stories of animals coming back. And that just really inspire us. And it makes us feel like the earth is recovering, but eventually we are going to have to go back outside, and we're going to emerge, and we're going to have to address this coexistence again. And there's some things we can really learn from communities that are living closest to wildlife, communities we work with, and also indigenous communities make up less than 5% of the human population. They manage 25% of the land on Earth, but 80% of the remaining biodiversity is on that land. I think that's just incredible. We've studied and we work with communities that live with wildlife all the time, and we've learned some really interesting things that can maybe help us when we rethink our relationship with wildlife in our own communities. Communities that have a relationship with wildlife that's more holistic, beyond just this economic value and cultural, even spiritual elements, tend to manage conflicts over resources with wildlife better than those that just put an economic value on it. I have a little story. A project that the Wildlife Trust of India did years ago with whale sharks is so beautiful. I just thought I'd discuss it really briefly. But whale sharks were coming off the coast of Gujarat, which is a province in India, to give birth in huge numbers. It was a whale shark nursery, really. But they were also being thinned in huge numbers and sold. So there was a project to stop the thinning. And instead of looking at it, as an alternative economic source or whatever, it was really intended to connect the people to the whale sharks. And people filmed the whale sharks underwater so that people could see how gentle and beautiful they are. They brought in a spiritual leader, a guru really, to talk about how the sharks coming to give birth there were like a daughter coming home to give birth, and that they should be nurtured and cared for, and that there was a real responsibility to care for these creatures. And it worked. I mean, it was a multifaceted campaign, but this aspect of it was really, really important. Eventually, it became a tourism revenue that people came to see the sharks, but that wasn't the core of the campaign. It's great now that it's a sense of pride for the community too. So my point is that many of us have really gotten this joy from seeing the wildlife return and being with our own animals at home during this time. And it's a time of transformation. And the question is, what is it gonna turn into? What is it gonna transform into? And I think that it's a time when we can start to value wildlife and animals for what they're really worth in their own right and what they bring to our well-being. But I'll stop my slides if I can. Yeah, okay. But I think these changes can't just be at a community level or at an individual level. They have to be reflected in policy. These communities that are doing these amazing things are really doing it in spite of this policy that's sort of stacked against us with this short-term economic growth focus. And so there's a whole range of policy things that can happen. Things like, stopping private ownership of big cats, which has been in the news lately, and other exotic pets, which can cause disease transmission, and not to mention the horrible situation that animals find themselves in. But it can go to much bigger things, like stopping the trade in live animals and stopping the consumption of live animals, wild animals. But it can also go to much, much bigger transformative changes in how we exploit animals and wildlife. It's bad for them, and it's bad for us. But I think we can go even bigger. Countries like Bhutan that are looking at gross national happiness instead of GDP, or countries like Iceland that have started doing this as well, are really inspirational. Most of these places don't include animals, though, in their measures of well-being, and we need to do that. We need to do it urgently. We're losing species, 1 million species threatened with extinction. Now is the time to include biodiversity indicators in those well-being policies. And then the UN Sustainable Development Goals are there's some conservation goals, but they're separate than the human well-being goals, and they can't be separate. I mean, conservation and animal welfare is fundamental to human well-being. Ultimately, I would say that we're all connected. And for me, in these dark times, these stories of wildlife make us happy. Our animals make us happy. I think this is a time when we can change our values and reflect them in our lives, our communities, and our policies. So I know my time is up, but before I turn it back over, we did a poll last year about wildlife and companion animals and happiness, and I thought it would be fun. We all thought it would be fun if we compared how our participants here, we have 170 at the moment, how our answers compared to the general poll results on the question, which I think we're going to put up now, about how being around pets contributes to an individual's happiness. So let's see if we can throw that up before we send it back. So if people feel comfortable responding to the poll, I will respond. Oh, hosts and panelists cannot vote. Oh. So we're going to get some answers on that, and then we'll come back to it. So while you guys are voting, we'll go back to Monica. And thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Beth. And I will say I can't vote either because I'm a panelist, but it helps me a lot. And I'm sure the other panelists feel the same way. So finally, we're going to turn to Lisa LaFontaine from the Humane Rescue Alliance, and she'll share with us some perspective on how things have changed on the ground for animal rescue organizations like her own in recent years, and now in particular, as a result of the pandemic. So thank you so much, Lisa, and welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Monica, and everybody. It's nice to be here. This has really been an amazing moment, and I really see it as an inflection point in how we respond, react, live with, advocate for animals. And I'll tell you a little bit about our experience just in the last few weeks, and there have been just so many surprises for us. So as we have animal shelters in Washington, D.C., as well as Northern New Jersey. We investigate cruelty and neglect. We respond to wildlife calls, and a lot of people don't know that Washington, D.C. has so much green space that's protected green space that actually one of the increasing call percentages is human-wildlife interactions. And so as we saw the pandemic coming toward our communities, one of our first instincts was to get all of the companion animals out of our shelters, because we were anticipating that there might be an influx of pets of people that were stricken by COVID, either needing temporary housing while owners were hospitalized, or perhaps even a permanent surrender into our custody because people couldn't take care of their pets. And so we put a plea out to the community to come and adopt or to foster. And we could not believe the response. And we especially couldn't believe it because people were in the midst of wondering about their own job security, their family's health, parents who might live from afar. But people just flocked to us, and our lobbies were filled with people who were adopting pets. But even more significantly, the phones are ringing off the hook, sometimes 40 or 50 calls a day from people who wanted to foster an animal from us. And so we quickly ran into a situation where we could not get foster animals into those homes because we were out of animals. And I mean, that changes on a daily basis. We see animals come in every day, but we were blown away by this response. And I started to really think about it as I started to observe people's quarantine and shelter-in-place behaviors. And some of the things I noticed were that people were flocking outside to walk with their dogs. And I think it goes back to what Stephanie showed in some of her slides, that being outdoors, walking, exercising, these are all happiness indicators, and people were flocking outside to walk with their dogs. But as I thought about this, opening your home to a homeless animal, I mean, that's a very intimate act, right? It's taking an animal you don't know into your couch, your bed, your family. And what what I realized is that people were feeling so helpless. Everything about their life had been upended. But here was something that they could give back. They could help our organization. They could help these animals move on to their next chapter. It was a feeling of powerfulness. And I think that's so important to humans' self-identity and happiness. And so quickly, chat groups and Facebook pages were filled with videos and pictures of people enjoying our animals. The other thing that struck me is that we were not seeing great intakes of animals from COVID-stricken households. And that told me that all the advocacy we've been doing, all the messaging we've been doing has been working because people had a plan for their pets, or they valued them so much that when they were the most sick and the most vulnerable, they wanted their pets with them to hold and comfort them. And so I was just blown away by the fact that in major cities from New York to DC to Seattle, who've really been affected by this pandemic, we were seeing less than a dozen animals coming into the city's shelter system. And that's a stunning statistics. And I think it tells us that companion animals, pets, are family in a way that they never have been before in our history. And, I think that the other thing that I realized is that animals create community. And so while people were lonely in their homes and maybe just interacting physically with their own family members and household members, they were joining our online chats to share pictures and make new friends and tell stories about these animals that they're fostering. And so I feel like this is a real inflection point where maybe our communities are going to want to foster our animals in large quantities, and we won't have to have the same kind of institutional sheltering of animals that we've had in the past. I also think it's an opportunity to link what's happening in the wild world and the farm animal world with the companion animal world, because once you really think about the sentience and the well-being of your own pet, you start to think about wild animals and farm animals. And so I think this is a really exciting and hopeful moment in our lives with animals, and I put all categories of animals together.
Thank you, Lisa, so much. That was great. I had to think of my own home last night. I didn't mention I have 2 dogs, 2 Labradoodles, and my son and his girlfriend are staying with us, and they brought their dog, and it was their dog's 2nd birthday last night. And so we had a Zoom family reunion to sing happy birthday to this adorable dog, Tenley, who's my grand dog. And it was really fun. We had a great time. So I certainly can relate to all of that. And it built our community last night and our family and friends to just have this moment to spend together via Zoom. So let's now dive into some questions with the panelists, because I think we can go a little bit deeper even into this wonderful topic that's already made me smile. So I'm going to start with Stephanie. Stephanie, let's go back to that fascinating slide about Egypt and the curves, the two lines on the chart where GDP and well-being and happiness didn't track at all. I wonder if you could explain whether that's consistent with other countries. Egypt was going through quite a time when you took that survey, but I wonder if you found it to be consistent in other places as well. We have a large audience today from all over the world, in fact, and so I'm wondering if you think that translates everywhere.
Yeah, I think it does. The lack of relationship between those two things is really stark when you look at a specific event like the Arab Spring. But I also think, one of the most commonly asked questions that I receive is about income and how that impacts life evaluation. And as I mentioned in the presentation, there is absolutely a relationship between income and life evaluation, because we know people have to meet their monthly expenses in order to live a fulfilled life. But what's interesting is there does reach a saturation point there, right? So after about $75,000 in household income in the US, we actually don't see appreciable gains in well-being. And I think it's a really good reminder that your well-being is so much more than your income. And I think that's why you see that story so clearly in Egypt, right? Is that there are significant events socially and politically that impact how we think about our well-being that go far beyond the economics, although economics is obviously an important part of it.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the other panelists had anything they wanted to add to that. I don't want to make this Okay. So Stephanie, let's dig even deeper into that with the U.S. and how you've seen our attitudes change over time, and whether there might even be some generational differences about these questions about income and well-being.
Yeah, so there are definitely generational difference in how we think about our well-being. So in the case of millennials, for example, and Generation Z, we find that as they think about their career well-being and their purpose, they derive tremendous value from the mission and purpose of their work. So those are the two most key guiding factors for them in selecting a career and a job, and how they think about their well-being within that job. So that's a key generational difference in how we evaluate our own well-being for those two generations. In general, when we look across the US, there are some key trends in how well-being has changed. There are some states that continue to just jump to the top of all the rankings in which we report. So Hawaii always does incredibly well for all the reasons that are obvious, right? They have exposure to that important wildlife that we mentioned and great quality of life. There are some states that also consistently come at the bottom of the list, like West Virginia. When you look at the entire country, what you see is New England does really well, as does the Pacific Northwest and the north area of the country, North Dakota, South Dakota, et cetera. The South tends to do worse in general when we look at regional differences. We find things like income, education, physical health that are incredibly important. There are some regional differences. But as we look at the country writ large, there's not tremendous differences year over year. And that's because so many of the factors that influence our well-being are pretty consistent over time when we think about some of those variables that I mentioned.
I think it's just fascinating. We use your data all the time in our Daily Planet. We actually cite it often because it is so striking how much agreement there is on both the importance of conservation and saving and preserving our environment and having clean air and clean water and people's sense of well-being and happiness. So I'm always struck by it. And I don't know if you're going to do the poll again. How often do you take the poll?
Yeah, so the Gallup poll is an annual study. So we are currently preparing for additional data collection this year, although it's a little more complicated this year for the obvious reasons. Safety of interviewers is our absolute priority. And in so much of the world, we're still using face-to-face data collection because telephone penetration rates aren't sufficiently high. So it'll look different. It'll be a little bit more complicated, but that's part of the art of doing a world study. So we will still be polling, and we're excited to see what happens next year. I mean, obviously, this is a significant disruption to how we think about our well-being globally. But that's really the reason it's probably more important than ever, honestly, to be tracking well-being. We've seen an incredible increase in the interest of people in measuring well-being and actually analyzing well-being data. And I think it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic for us to talk about that topic a little bit more seriously, but hopefully that'll sustain post-COVID-19.
I do think that's something that we have all experienced, is sort of that recognition, this sort of aha moment. It's terrible that it took us this pandemic for us to have this moment to recognize how much both our animals and being with them and family and nature mean to us as a society, and how much more we're able to appreciate it. I actually read a wonderful story in the Boston Globe yesterday about a mother bear who had been active in a neighborhood in Hanover, New Hampshire, and she was really interacting too much with the citizens who were really scared of her. So they moved her north to the very northern part of New Hampshire, really near the border, and they put a collar on her so they could watch her. And it actually turned out she made her way all the way back down the state and found her way back to Hanover, because that's what was home to her. And the citizens in Hanover actually were glad to see her back. And she went into hibernation, and she's come back out this spring with 3 cubs. And when she returned to Hanover after her long struggle home, she was very thin and haggard, and then went into hibernation. And now she's come back out looking glorious with a beautiful coat. And the citizens are learning how to both socially distance from each other and from the bear. And this is a real teachable moment for the whole community. It's just a wonderful story. I recommend it. But it says so much about how this moment is teaching us about ourselves and about nature and our interactions with nature, our relationship to nature. So I want to ask Beth, tell us some more stories. I'm struck by the work that IFAW did in Australia around rescuing animals after the terrible fires. I'd be curious to know more about how both the policies are developed around some of these events and how you connect the dots for people at IFAW.
Yeah, well, I think that your story there, the story of the bear, is really interesting because it's very easy to suggest that people live with wildlife in Africa, for example, because we love lions and we love elephants and we want them to live with them. But it's a real challenge to live with predators and to live with elephants who come in and, you know, take crops and trample them and kill people. And so these communities have had to deal with this for a really long time. And there's certain things that humans have to do to reduce the impact of and to reduce the potential for conflict. And yet, you know, in places like the United States and Europe, we've eliminated a lot of our predators so that we don't have to do that. And but I think now we really need to consider other ways of dealing with our potentially challenging but really amazing native wildlife. And so I think this is something that we are called to do now in this new post-COVID era. Look at the communities that are able to deal with these things, even though they're challenging, and still appreciate their wildlife, you know. And I think we have to do similar things. You know, people ask us in disasters, why do you go and rescue wildlife, or why are you worried about animals when people are impacted by natural disasters? And there's so many answers to that. I mean, first of all, helping animals helps people. And most people are, their animals are their family. They're not going to evacuate. They're not going to, they're just not going to leave without their animals. In some cases, internationally, those same animals are their livelihoods. In the case of, you know, a sheep or a cow or their chickens, they're also their protein with their eggs and their milk. So, you know, there's a lot of complicated factors there. And in the case of Australia, 1 billion animals died in the fires, you know, and that's not just a human, the impact it has on our psyche to lose those animals, but it's a huge implication to how are those ecosystems going to recover without the animals that are critical to them. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's not people or animals, basically. It's animals are critical to people. Plus, they have an existence value in their own right. Even if there were no people on this planet, they should be able to live. But we can't live without them. And so it is a responsibility to, for our own existence, to find a way to live in harmony with them and to save them. Because it's the reason that they're dying and is our exploitation of them and their habitats. And so we need to find a solution that works for them and can work for us, because it'll make us better off in the end.
Yes. So tell us a little bit more about your work there with communities and those smaller predators like coyotes and fox, and how you've in the past been really actively working with communities to try to minimize those conflicts.
Well, here in the United States, one of the things that we're trying to do is help people help understand what the conflict can be, and so to help figure out how we can reduce those conflicts, because, you know, the animals are not going to change their behavior. So where this native wildlife is coming into our suburban and urban areas, you know, that's newly being experienced by people, especially on the East Coast. What are the things that we can do to, you know, cover our trash, for example? In the case, there's some pretty high profile stuff going on in Cape Cod around the seals. You know, what are the things that we can do? We can be seals are adorable, and they look a little bit like dogs in their faces. They're not. They're wildlife, and we need to be separate from them. We need to socially distance ourselves from wildlife all the time, not just during COVID. So even though they're cute, don't take selfies up next to them because they'll bite, and it's not their fault. It's ours for being too close. And so there are a lot of things we can do to minimize that conflict, and to just accept that it's our responsibility. It's not the wildlife. If the wildlife comes in and is tempted by your dog that looks like a tasty treat, get your dog away from the wildlife. Don't expect the wildlife to understand the difference between your adorable dog and the squirrel. It's horrible and it feels really bad, but leash your dog at dawn and dusk, or those times when it's going to be more of a conflict time. And also, these native wildlife, these predators, small predators, also serve a really valuable purpose, in these areas too. They can eliminate some of the maybe the rats or some of these things that we're not as fond of. So there are some really valuable services that wildlife, and bats. Can I just talk about bats for a second? Because bats have gotten a super bad rap lately as being a disease vector. Bats have developed this hardy immune system by living all together, and they don't die from diseases that they can potentially transmit. But it's not bats' fault. It's our relationship with bats, being too close to them, eating them, doing some things like that. As long as we're not exploiting wildlife and having too close a relationship with it, it's fine on its own. And bats perform really terribly important services. They're pollinators, they eat tons of bugs. We need bats. Destroying bats is not going to keep us healthy. It'll actually make us less healthy. So just a plug for the value of bats. And I'm sure that Lisa has a lot to say on these same topics, but that's what I would say about some of those questions.
So I'll come back to you, Beth, in a minute, because you touched on two things I don't want to miss, wildlife markets and the recent special about tigers in captivity here in the US. But let me jump to Lisa for a minute, because I think there's a fascinating thing that you've learned from looking at wildlife cams, or cameras that I think were staged out in neighborhoods in order to see what might be there. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned from the DC cameras that are now showing us incredible pictures during the pandemic.
Sure. So I'm a New Hampshire girl like that bear, so I can appreciate her clambering to get to her most beautiful spot that she loves. But one of the things that's been so interesting to me in moving from New Hampshire to Washington, D.C. to do animal welfare in an urban environment is that I see more wildlife now than I did in my decades in New Hampshire. And it's because the nation's capital is filled with green space. And you only need to be landing at National Airport just to see how closely packed in people are with wild animals. And so I see wildlife all the time, and we get so many calls about wild animals. We're doing a project right now with a number of different parties, including the Smithsonian, to really understand how many cats live outdoors in DC, because we know that there is a really robust outdoor cat community. And I use the word community because those cats are members of neighborhoods who come out together and take care of those cats outdoors. And so it's a different type of cat ownership or stewardship than the kind we have when we have a cat in the house. But one of the things we're doing is using camera traps, and those aren't really traps. What they do is they trap the image of the animal to try to identify where are cats living in the district. And we are noticing two really different things, which is that cats who live outside have completely different feeding patterns than those who live inside, because they are adapting to the predators around them and the outdoor environment that they're in. But the other thing that we're seeing, and it's happening more powerfully now because people have more time to look at the images, is we're seeing wildlife in people's backyards right now on those cameras. And so people are posting pictures of a group of fox kittens playing on their backyard deck, or a group of animals just walking through their backyard. And I think that it's building this appreciation for the wild beings who live around us all the time. I mean, there's nothing new about this. We're just seeing them a little bit more because we're sitting in our houses more looking outside, but also with us indoors, they're out and about and doing their thing just a little bit more than usual.
Yes. Beth, you told a story the other day as we were preparing for this about how your neighbors now have a group chat about when they see certain wildlife in the neighborhood, like an eagle or a fox. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, in my neighborhood, and I know that several of our IFAW team are seeing the same thing, that people who can be divided in some other lines, politically or socially, in some other ways, are really coming together in the neighborhoods just to report, there's just this morning there was a red fox, down the street, and the people came to, we're all talking about where they saw it, what they did. And later on, I'm going to be on the Smithsonian or Optimism Summit, and there was they were talking about how the zoo cams are also they're being used more. More people are viewing them, and they're staying on longer just because people want to see what's going on with the animals. But I think this neighborhood thing is really, really interesting because people are bridging a lot of different gaps and coming together over animals in a way that is pretty well, it's unifying, and it's just really it's really heartening. And that's the kind of thing, actually, and not to get too far afield, but that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in the communities that are successfully living with wildlife around the world. It's something that it comes from the heart, not just from putting a dollar value on it. Because when you put a dollar value on your wildlife and the economy falls apart, there's no reason not to sell it. If it only meant an income to your community, then if someone comes along with a higher value for your land, then why would you not sell your land and all the wildlife on it? But if there's something a little bit more cultural, spiritual connection for it, then there's a reason to maintain it, even in a little bit harder times. And I think that maybe we're starting to see this value shift that is, like Stephanie was saying, where our values are not tied to GDP. They're tied to a whole bunch of factors, including what the rest of the species and the world means to us. So.
That's fantastic, Beth. So just wanted to transition there to wildlife markets and just give you a minute to talk about that as it relates to the pandemic. I know you all were doing work on this before and were concerned about the potential. And now with Dr. Anthony Fauci having said perhaps we should have these wildlife markets better regulated or even closed in some places, I'd wonder what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, we are, clearly there's an amazing opportunity here to look at what is happening with our exploitation of wildlife, and how that relates to disease transmission and also to the animals themselves, whether they, transmit disease or not. So definitely we're looking at, there's the Chinese government is banning live animal consumption and trade. The US government is looking at similar things. I think one of the really interesting issues that arises that we need to be really careful about is what happens to communities. Also right now with tourism, tourism has stopped in Africa, and there are entire communities that were reliant on it, that and also with wildlife trade, honestly, that we have to figure out what's going to happen to these communities in the short term and in the long term if this source of income is gone. Hopefully tourism will recover. Obviously, we want that to happen. And so, but in the short term, how can we support these communities to keep going and not have to poach for protein or something else. And then in the long term, how can we support communities to move away from exploiting wildlife for trade or for any other source? Because it's a responsibility that we have. If we're closing markets, that we have to figure out how people who relied on them are going to live. I mean, it's simple as that. You're muted, Monica.
Thank you for I have dogs here and I'm afraid they're gonna come running in and bark, so I keep muting myself. So Lisa, I wanted to ask you, you told us a story the other day as we were preparing about some of the incredible work being done by our first responders now with respect to animals. Tell us about that, because we are stressed and we do have we're putting a lot on those folks, but tell us about how they're responding.
Well, I had an amazing story happen the day after we spoke on Tuesday, where we got a call from the community that a bald eagle had gotten himself into trouble was trapped in the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters parking garage. And so our officers for the Humane Rescue Alliance are the first responders, and they went out with tarps and other gentle means of capture and were able to safely rescue the eagle, and he was released the next day to absolutely glorious images, and was met by his mate, actually, and they had a real ruckus when they got back together. The other thing that happened a couple weeks ago in the midst of the shutdown is that somebody's blind, deaf, 17-year-old little dog fell into a manhole and unfortunately started traveling underneath the city and got stuck under another manhole that was probably 200 pounds welded shut. And so the community came out. It was kind of like baby Jessica in the well from Texas 20 years ago, where the entire community came out and was doing what they could to rescue this dog, calling his name, providing support to his owner. And our officers worked with the fire department, the water department, to get the manhole cover removed, and actually climbed through the sewer system to rescue the dog. And 6 hours later, when our officer came up with the dog, people were now following this and they were cheering for this outcome. And it was a moment of community. And I really think that we've got to resolve ourselves to really leverage this moment that we have right now, because I think that we are building up a collective gratitude to animals at this time, because our lives are so limited in so many ways. But think about what animals are doing for us, wild animals, but also our own pets. And one of the best, Stephanie's survey results pointed out several really important things. One is that having someone to count on and experiencing generosity are key happiness indicators. Well, that's what our pets do for us. We count on them. They make no mistake, they count on us, but we count on them too. And we experience an exchange of generosity with our companion animals. And so I think they're doing a lot to inoculate us against some of the fears and the cares that we have. And I don't think that we're ever going to forget what they've done for us during this time, particularly the people that live alone and have lost human touch. At least they have their animals to touch right now. And we are only as good as the transactions that we put in our bank. And think about what a dog or a cat does for us with every wag of the tail, every kind look, every purr, every jump in the lap. They make a deposit, a happiness deposit into our lives. And we treasure that. And I think that we're appreciating that right now. And I only look back to another really powerful US societal event that was also a landmark in our relationship with animals, which was Hurricane Katrina. And I was not surprised by this. Animal professionals were not surprised by this, but society was surprised that people would actually risk their lives for their pets. They would stay in their houses. They would not leave their animals. And And so something really amazing has happened in the last couple of decades between us and animals. And I think we've got to harvest that right now and harvest it for good and take all the lessons and build policy, build practices, build community around what we're learning.
So incredibly profound, actually. And I want to actually ask you, Stephanie, a hard question, which is, how do you think public opinion will shift after this pandemic? I'm wondering whether you think we'll see the results of it bear out in even with animals and the support we've had.
That's a great question. I mean, I think we would probably be remiss not to say that well-being will likely decline over time, over the next 12 months, and probably even the next few years as we bounce back economically. But I will say the thing that I think gives me the most encouragement as we think about well-being and what COVID-19 has done to societies around the world is that, you know, one of the key findings in the World Happiness Report was that these interpersonal issues of trust and our trust in institutions really does buoy well-being. It makes a tremendous difference. That's why we see those Nordic countries are always at the top of that list. They have just such heightened levels of trust in one another and in their country. And, you know, we hear every day, I think, a new great story about kindness expressed in our communities. And that really encourages me because as we are able to build higher levels of interpersonal trust again through this emergency, I do think we're going to be far more resilient than if not when we come out of this. So that's my hope, is that we take the lessons of kind of humanity that we've, I think, importantly gained over the last few months and bring that forward so that we can recover, not just as the US, but really globally.
Coming to a close, but I just have to notice that your cat is sitting over your shoulder. It's so adorable. One of them.
She's joined us. That's Fiona.
Great. We needed an animal in this.
She only has 5 cat seats to sit on in this one room, so she's picked the one with the review.
It's so funny. So Beth, I want to give you 1 minute to talk quickly about Tiger King and live wild animals in captivity here in the US, and then the survey results. We have our survey results from our poll.
Okay, well, Tiger King, complicated. So I won't talk so much about Tiger King other than to say it has brought attention to a very important issue, which is tigers in private ownership in the US. I'm not going to talk about all the other crazy issues it brings attention to, which are really a distraction to the most important thing, which is people should not have tigers in their houses. They should not be in roadside zoos. And private ownership of exotics is it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem for the animals. It's a problem for the public safety. And so we have a campaign we've had for, it's been 12 years now, I think, or more, 15, that we've been trying to get these dangerous cats out of private ownership. And we hope that with this mass attention to Tiger King now, that it might actually spur the bill which would ban private ownership to finally get through, which would be terrific. Now, of course, there's exotics. People have monkeys, people have all kinds of exotics, which can be quite dangerous. And so one of the things that exotic pets, other than, you know, attacking people, and there's, in many states, there's absolutely no registration. People don't even know if their next door neighbors have this kind of thing. We have first responders who are really supportive of this legislation because you know, they come to deal with a domestic dispute and there's a tiger in the house. It's a huge problem. But they can also spread disease, and so there's all kinds of issues with it. So we really hope that we can get this issue resolved, and the people just don't have to worry about it anymore. It's just a huge issue. But there are more tigers. People don't know this, but there are many people don't know this, but there are more tigers in private ownership in the U.S. than there are wild tigers in the world, and it's a horrifying stat. Okay, so, but ending on a fun note, the poll that we all did on this webinar was this, right? How much do you feel that having or being around pets contributes to an individual's happiness? our poll overwhelmingly shows a lot or some compared to the poll that we did in 2019, where 66% of the respondents said a lot, 28% said some, 5% said very little, and 1% said none at all. So I would say that we might be a little skewed about the people who were interested in this webinar. But thank you very much for doing the poll.
Yes, that's great. Thank you all for doing the poll and for being here with us this morning. It's been a great session. I want to put in a plug for conserving nature for nature's sake. There's a campaign called 30 by 30 to preserve 30% of the world by 2030. And I want to put in a plug for you, Beth, later on the main stage at the Earth Optimism Summit. Tune in at 3:50 to see Beth with more discussion about animals and human well-being. And thank you so much, ladies. This was really fun. It made me smile. It will keep me happy all day long thinking about all we've said. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this morning.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Well,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.